if you put it all together, you can certainly say that there is good evidence to show that both commanders on the ground and higher commanders are involved in war crimes in Gaza.
That was Professor Omer Bartov. Professor Bartov is a historian at Brown University and he holds the title, believe it or not, Samuel Pisar Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies. What's interesting about him is that he started his journey right in the center of the conflict in Israel where he was born, and from there he went up the academic ranks from the Tel Aviv University all the way to Oxford. Now, Professor Bartov has made his name by digging into some of the darkest facets of humanity, like the Holocaust and genocide. Despite, or probably because of the gravity of his research subject, he developed a way of illuminating these events in a completely new light. But there's the part that makes him relevant for our discussion today, because Professor Bartov doesn't just stick to the past, which is probably what you might expect from an historian. Instead, he's got some serious thoughts on what's happening right now, especially regarding the situation in Israel and Palestine. Bartov's take on the Israel-Palestine conflict goes completely against the twisted justifications for the mass killings in Gaza that is so relentlessly propagated on all of the mainstream media. As you will see in a moment, Bartov has the courage to speak out, and he does so with some personal risk. It is through his work that he encourages us to see the conflict not just as a matter of land or politics, but as a complex interplay of first-person history, collective memory and human stories, the traumas and the way people's identities and lives get completely wrapped up in these conflicts. So as you will see, our discussion is not about theoretical academia, on the contrary. Professor Bartov is all about understanding the root cause of the conflict and, equally important, about the transfer of this knowledge to a receptive audience, an audience which is, like yourself, no longer satisfied with propaganda, misinformation and fake news. The interview with 90 minutes is again in long form format, but I just could not bring myself to cut it down to accommodate YouTube's mighty algorithm for wider distribution. I feel that it would diminish the quality of the interview and it would not do justice to Professor Bartov or to you, the audience of my channel. However, as always, I have added chapters and timestamps below in the description for you. And before we now jump into the interview, the last chapter is about first-person history. I would really recommend you to watch it because it not only makes the whole story so much more personal, but it offers a surprisingly simple solution. Omer Bartov, many greetings from the dark Netherlands here to the sunny, where are you?
In Cambridge, Massachusetts, where it's raining.
Where it's raining, sorry to hear. Okay.
Yeah.
Very briefly, you have a more than impressive career, right? You're a professor and you're a specialist in regards to genocide. Yeah? You're a professor of Holocaust and genocide studies at the Brown University. And I have seen you wrote at least 5 or 6 books, 3 of which I picked out. It's Genocide, the Holocaust, and Israel-Palestine. The other one is Voices on War and Genocide. I think that's the book about first-person testimonies, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, and I actually published 10 books, but
Okay, I failed in my research, miserable. I found 6. Okay, and then there's another one, Anatomy of a Genocide, right?
Correct. Yes.
I picked the first person testimony because that's of special interest to me, but we will come back to that later.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the US Holocaust Museum called you one of the world's leading experts on the subject of genocide. And I will give you in a moment, I'll give you occasion to explain why that is. And something more recently. So I saw that you signed 2 petitions, but it could be more. Again, I only found 2. If you tell me it's 4, it's more.
Yeah.
Academics for Peace. So there was the first one, I believe, in August this year, the elephant in the room, the occupation. And there was a second one, Biden to stop the assault on Gaza. And both of them were signed, last time I checked, between 2,000 and 3,000 academics have signed those petitions, right?
Yes, correct. And I was involved in not just signing, but certainly the first one, the elephant in the room, I was among one of four academics originally, and then a few more who articulated their thought a great deal about it before we put it out, as was the case with the second one. So, these were attempts to draw attention to what we saw were cardinal issues, both before the October 7th attack and afterwards.
And what would you say? What's your hope? What would you like to see achieved with it?
Well, I mean, so the elephant in the room, which we issued on August 4th, drew attention to what we saw as the difference between the very impressive protests that there were at the time in Israel against the so-called judicial reform, which was really a judicial coup or an attempted coup by the Netanyahu government to greatly weaken the judiciary and strengthen the executive. So we were very much supportive of the protests, but we pointed out that the protests and the protesters refused to see the elephant in the room, which was the occupation, and that the occupation of Palestinians and Palestinian lands were really the main incentive for that judicial coup, with the goal of intensifying the settlement in the West Bank and eventually of annexing it. And so our point was that it is time to see what is the actual cause of both the attempt for an internal coup, and what that government was all about. Now, that was 2 months before the October 7th attack. And when that happened, at least the way we saw it, I certainly saw it that way, it showed that we were right. That is, that what was going on was really the occupation. And the occupation had blown up in everybody's face with the Hamas attack. And it is now, it has meant that the Palestinian issue, that the Netanyahu government, not only this one, but Netanyahu over the last 20 years, and not only Netanyahu, had been trying to basically sweep under the rug and manage rather than resolve. And so the second petition that we issued was a much more specific, regarding the actual ongoing violence in Gaza right now. So we have condemned, and I certainly have condemned, the heinous attack by Hamas, which included murders of children, of old people, rapes. There was nothing that one could condone about that attack, and ended up with hundreds of hostages, including elderly people, children, and so forth. But the response by Israel has been a massive attack on Gaza, with vast numbers of civilian casualties, going over 20,000 as we speak today. And what we argued, A, that you cannot respond to massacre by massacre, and B, that it is time to bring about a ceasefire with a look toward a political resolution of this conflict rather than an attempt to bomb it out of existence.
Yeah. And I found your position especially remarkable because you have a very balanced view, despite the fact that I believe your daughter-in-law was in the kibbutz that was attacked, and one of your family members, if I saw this correctly, is actually one of the hostages. So that makes
Correct.
your position truly remarkable.
Correct. I mean, she personally was not in the kibbutz. She was in Tel Aviv, but her mother was in the kibbutz. She grew up in that kibbutz. Somewhere around 85 members of the kibbutz were murdered. Quite a number of people were kidnapped, including her cousin and her cousin's husband. And the cousin was released after about 50 days, but the husband is still there. And one can only hope that he's still alive.
So before we really dive into those details, in your own words, How do you view what happened on October the 7th?
Look, I mean, it depends a great deal on one's perspective, how you contextualize what happened. So the actual event was an attack, a well organized, well orchestrated attack by hundreds and hundreds of Hamas militants, whose goal was to kill both military and civilians. And there was a clear goal to kill civilians. And it was successful in large part because the Israeli military botched the entire thing absolutely miserably. And the reason that it did not respond as it did, and to the extent that people waited 8, 12 hours before the military arrived, and you have to imagine driving down from Tel Aviv to Kibbutz Be'eri takes about 90 minutes. It's a small country. So why would it take 8 hours for the military, which is supposed to be on alert in the area? Why would it take them so long to get there? So this was botched terribly. Now, the reason is, first of all, that the Israeli military did not expect such an attack, despite the fact that intelligence was telling them that Hamas was planning that attack, and they knew about it for months in advance. But they believed that they were totally superior to Hamas, that there was no way that these militants could cross the sophisticated multi-billion fence that they had built and attack civilians. But the larger context for this, I'd say, is that this attack, which, as I say, the attack itself was a heinous attack and was meant to kill civilians and to humiliate people. But the larger context for that is that Israel believed that it could keep over 2 million people caged in a very small territory under conditions of siege. And that all those people could do would be to lob a few rockets at Israeli settlements every once in a while. The idea that you could manage those people proved to be false. If you keep people under such dehumanizing conditions, under such brutalizing conditions, you can expect that at some point they will try to come out and hurt you. It's the most natural thing to do. And the larger context for that, even larger than that, is that Israel has kept Palestinians since 1967 under occupation. 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank, 2 million Palestinians in Gaza, and has decided that instead of seeking a political resolution to this, it could just control them, and in the case of the West Bank, also increasingly take over the territory. And so if we try to see that within the larger context, we can only conclude that the only way to put an end to this kind of violence, both the kind of Hamas violence and the kind of destruction that is being wrought now by the Israeli military, is to find a political solution and not a military one.
I believe I heard you say when you were a soldier, there were about 350,000 people in Gaza, and now there are 2.2 million. And to put this, put a picture in people's mind, the length of Gaza is shorter than a marathon, right? So
Exactly.
It's literally just a couple of kilometers, for 2.2 million people. I think it's the third most populated spot on this planet.
Yes, and you have to understand that at the moment, the northern part of Gaza is basically a sea of debris. It's been destroyed. There have been photographs coming in just in the last two days or so, since some foreign media have finally been allowed in. And so these 2.2 or 2.3 million Palestinians are now congested into an ever-shrinking part of the Gaza Strip without any infrastructure to support them. And the danger of this becoming a total humanitarian disaster is imminent. And right now, certainly not enough is being done to stop that ongoing humanitarian disaster. So yes, it's a very small area. It is one, we know other places. It is an area that could be totally different. One could develop it. One could make it into a very prosperous area. Many people can live in small areas if you provide them with opportunities. There's a seaport there, there can be an airport there. But none of that has been done. On the contrary, it has become basically an area where people are caged in without any prospects for a better life. And that is what has to change.
Yeah, you said it now twice, caged. Before I dove into this whole topic of the, in lack of a better word, Israel-Palestine conflict a year ago, I only had a vague perception of what caged actually means for the Palestinians. Yeah, I heard Netanyahu say it's working. Yeah, we are separating. We have tunnels and overpasses and so on. But it's actually unbelievable. You have to go up at 4 o'clock in the morning to stand 3 hours in front of a gate together with hundreds, if not thousands, other people squeezed into literally a cage. All sides, also from the top, is caged. You're depending on the goodwill of a couple of soldiers there. There's humiliation going on, and every single day.
Yes, this is when people from Gaza, where there was right now, the conditions are, of course, much worse, but before all this happened, there were tens of thousands of Gazans who were going to work in Israel because there was massive unemployment in Gaza itself. So, in order to pass through these checkpoints, that's where you see these conditions that you're describing, that people have to go through these checkpoints, which is actually the same as happens in the West Bank when people, where there's slightly more space, but when people try to cross the checkpoints to work on the Israeli side, then they also go through these congested and humiliating, literally, iron cages, so as to come out on the other side.
And the world focused now on Gaza, right? But there is a second kind of hidden conflict going on in the West Bank. I think more than 300 300 Palestinians have died since October 7, right? The settlers, this militarized, militias almost, right? I think Ben Gvir handed out 10,000 automatic guns and so to them, right?
Yes, so in the West Bank, what you're seeing is really a sort of creeping ethnic cleansing, where isolated communities under pressure from the settlers, from settler militias, and from the military. And much of the military there is recruited from among the settlers, so they just change uniforms, intimidating Palestinians into leaving those communities, and have been killing, as you say, probably more than 300 by now, since October 7th. And this is, there's more and more warnings coming out right now that this will eventually lead to another intifada in the West Bank, another uprising. And I suspect that people like Ben Gvir and Smotrich and other settler leaders, whether in the government or in the West Bank, are hoping for that to happen, because then they could finally get the Israeli military to try and push large numbers of Palestinians out of the West Bank. That is their dream. That is what they want to do. And it's probably the reason that there still has not been an uprising in the West Bank, because Palestinians there understand that massive force might be used against them at this point. So it's sort of happening under the radar. It's not widely reported, but there's ongoing violence by settlers and the military. Most of the people being killed are killed by soldiers. And there's very little reporting, and there's hardly any investigation of any of these killings.
Because you said hoping it to happen, right? a video surfaced on social media from Netanyahu, actually, where he said he was hoping for an incident that would justify a war to expel all all Palestinians. That's my understanding.
Yes, I don't know exactly which recording you're referring to. Is it recent? Is it?
That it resurfaced recently, but it's a couple of years old, right?
Oh, yeah. I've not seen that. Netanyahu usually, at least until October 7th, was careful with what he said. We all know what he wants, but he was careful about saying it. So I have not heard that. But there's no doubt that the people who surround him, these individuals, especially Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, who are the heads of the national religious movement, who are the settlers in the West Bank, what they would like to do is to take over the entire territory and to empty it of its Palestinian population. As for Netanyahu, it's a bit hard to say. I mean, I think that Netanyahu was hoping before October 7th that he could just maintain things as they are, and meanwhile organize all kind of relations with other Arab states. You ask about the October 7th attack. I think that the immediate incentive for Hamas to carry out that attack was Netanyahu's policy, was the imminence, the apparent imminence of an agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia brokered by the United States. And for Hamas, this meant that the Palestinian issue would disappear entirely because Saudi Arabia is the most important Arab country, and it would sort of say, yeah, we also care about the Palestinians, but generally we're much more interested in good relations with the United States. And so, although they prepared the attack well in advance, I think that the incentive was that imminent agreement. And so if you look at it from Netanyahu's point of view, I think that he was happy just isolating Gaza and letting people rot there with nobody paying attention to Gaza. I mean, the world's attention was not on Gaza at all. And gradually, but intensifying the settlement of the West Bank and making life increasingly unbearable for the Arab population there, so that eventually, whenever the opportunity presents itself, they could be moved out. That's, I think, the way he was thinking about it. And of course, the whole thing blew up. But it has to be said that this is not only Netanyahu and it's not only the radical settlers to his right. The Israeli public in general, the vast majority of the Israeli public, did not want to know about the Palestinian issue. It was completely marginalized. Yes, people were called up to serve, and then they basically policed those areas, whether it was the sort of borders of Gaza or it was breaking into homes and working in checkpoints in the West Bank. But generally, the public accepted that as, yeah, we can do this for the near future, and it's not harming us in any way. The economy was prospering, people were having a good time, and meanwhile, these 5 million Palestinians were living under worsening and worsening conditions. So Netanyahu, was working with the public, which even those who did not vote for him, by and large, accepted this as a reality. That reality has changed completely. That cannot come back. Whatever happens now, you cannot reverse what happened on October 7th, and of course, not the destruction in Gaza.
Before we move too far away from October 7, I have two questions, if I may, and I know it's not good to ask compound questions. So first of all, there came reports from Israel, amongst of which was Haaretz, that at least some of the dead victims from October 7 were victims from so-called friendly fire. Yeah, there are videos from helicopters who shoot all these fleeing cars. There are videos where you see literally hundreds of cars, not only burned, but smashed. Yeah. This is not an RPG from Hamas. This was large scale. There are reports from Israeli tanks firing into the kibbutz where they knew there were hostages and terrorists, right? And that brings me back to my second. Also, the friendly fire is question one, and the second one is the Hannibal doctrine. I leave it to you to comment on both.
So on the first case, the one incident that I am aware of, to the extent that it's been already admitted by the military and reported widely in Israel. There have been many rumors about other cases, but this case appears to be totally authentic. Is that a tank that came into kibbutz Be'eri actually, was ordered by a general who was there on the ground to fire at least one shell into a building or near a building, according to one version, to collapse the building, in which it was known that there were hostages and militants, Hamas militants. And we know that also from a woman who had been there and had managed to get out and was saying to the general there that there are hostages there. And so this is a case that we know about. I suspect that there were others. Now, what do you take from that? I don't think it takes away anything from the kind of massacre that was carried out by Hamas. And there's nothing in this to serve to condone what Hamas did, including rapes and so forth. It does mean that the Israeli army proved itself to have been ill-prepared. The response was completely chaotic. And there were cases in which people acted extremely irresponsibly as military commanders on the ground. So there were cases of heroism. There were all kinds of cases of people who were rushing in with pistols and saving people. And there are other cases in which the military acted very rashly. To my mind, what is much more important is your second question. And it's not just the Hannibal, so-called Hannibal method or whatever they call it. And the example for that, and that's now being debated in some parts in Israel. There were 3 hostages who managed to get away, were in hiding for a few days, and were then shot by friendly fire. And they were shot from a very close distance by a sniper and then by other troops. The last one was shot by other troops. Apparently about 15 minutes later, he managed to escape from Israeli fire and then was shot. And the circumstances of that are telling, because those people, at least one of them, knew exactly what you need to do so as to not be shot by troops who are underground, who are under fire, who are afraid that, they would be shot at. So he had them take off their shirts so that they won't be seen as potentially carrying explosives. And they improvised a white flag, and they were shouting in Hebrew to the soldiers. And they also wrote on walls with leftover food, "We are hostages. There are 3 hostages here." And they were shot. And what that tells you is not that Israeli troops wanted to shoot Israeli hostages. What it tells you is that when the army says that this was an error, it was not an error. That is, the kind of orders that the troops have on the ground is, if you're in doubt, shoot. The second thing that is important here is that the method being used by the military, and that's not just the Hannibal procedure, it's much more than that. The method is that the army distributes all kinds of leaflets to tell the population to leave because this area is going to be an area of operations. After a while, they say, okay, we told them to leave. Now, anybody who remains there is potentially a militant, and we are not going to check who they are and what they are. And then in order to save the lives of Israeli troops, they bring in the Air Force, they bring in heavy artillery, they bring in tanks, and they bring in bulldozers, and they literally flatten the area. And that is the reason that you have such high numbers of civilian casualties. That is, people are basically, after they have been told to leave, if they stay behind for one reason or another, they may be sick, they may be old, they may just not want to leave their homes, they are now seen as potential enemies and they can be killed. And so this is a procedure that was developed by the IDF earlier for early operations, but at the time it was done on a relatively small scale, only in very small parts of the Gaza Strip. This time it's being implemented in all of northern Gaza, and the IDF seems to want to do it also in southern Gaza and is being held back to some extent by the US administration and to some extent by the understanding that whoever is left of the hostages are right there, and so that they would kill them if they do it. That is really at the core of the massive destruction of property and lives in Gaza. And the case of the 3 soldiers who were killed is an indication of how the army operates generally. And it was brought to light because it so happened that they were actually hostages and not just 3 more Palestinians who would have been shot without anybody reporting on it.
There were incidents because you said the army distributed leaflets to stimulate the people to leave, right? Many people left. They left through pre-assigned corridors, and then I'm aware of at least 3 incidents where these caravans of leavers were actually bombed, right? So for me, as an outsider, I try to understand what were the 3 accidents, so to speak. I mean, these were assigned safety corridors for the people who were fleeing. So what's behind this when Israel bombs those people? Do they really want them to leave? That's actually my question.
So there's, it's very hard to judge specifically on specific cases if you don't have enough information, right? And information comes from all kinds of people, but there are no objective or hardly any objective observers on the ground. So it is very hard to tell about specific cases. But I would say that there has been now a fair amount of research done, and it was published by 972, by this very good and very critical publication, that the argument by the military, I think the military wants the population to leave because it's easier for them to operate. But the argument by the military that they're not targeting civilians at all turns out not to be entirely true. That is, that in order to get people to leave, they actually do target areas where there are civilian populations so as to give them added incentive to leave. And that's what this investigation seems to have shown, that there were areas that were like a series of tenements that were hit by aerial bombs, very accurate aerial bombs, hitting civilian homes in order to get people to leave. And so this is intentional killing of civilians with what is perceived by the military a military goal. Now, in the case of people fleeing into safe zones, as you know, I think the New York Times showed just recently, again with satellite photos and so forth, that in the areas that were declared by the Israeli military as safe areas, or relatively safe areas, the Israeli Air Force has dropped scores of 2,000-pound bombs. Those 2,000-pound bombs, 1-ton bombs, destroy everything. And they have been used in areas with highly congested civilian population, where by any account, even if Hamas militants were identified there, and even if you wanted to hit them, using this kind of munitions could count as a war crime, because it is the kind of munition that is assured to kill large numbers of civilians. There's no question about it, in order, hypothetically, to kill a few militants. And there have apparently been scores and scores of such bombs used. These are bombs that are, by the way, produced in the United States. Uh, and so all of this, I think, if you put it all together, you can certainly say that there is good evidence that hopefully will be investigated forensically to show that both commanders on the ground and higher commanders are involved in war crimes in Gaza. I think, I don't know if that investigation will ever be carried out, but if it is, I think that the evidence is very powerful to show that these were war crimes. I'll just add that, and not only for the sake of balance, but for the sake of truth, that what Hamas carried out on October 7th was also a war crime and a crime against humanity. And if one could get one's hands on the people who orchestrated it or implemented it, they also should stand trial for these crimes. It's just that one crime does not justify another.
I think you said something very important. One crime does not justify another. I had a look at the Geneva Convention for what it's worth, right? So Article 3, you may not kill civilians. Basically it says violence to life and person, right? Article 33, collective punishment. Article 7, forced movement of civilians. Article 53, obliterating civilian infrastructure like hospitals, schools, etc., etc. Yeah. How should I say this? How impactful or how useful are, is an institution like the Geneva Convention in such a situation?
Well, look, I mean, I'll say two things. First of all, the argument that the public in Israel hears all the time, and I constantly listen to the Israeli media, is that, well, Hamas is using the civilians as human shields. And therefore, we don't have a choice. They attacked us. We have to retaliate, and they're hiding under hospitals, in schools, and so forth, in mosques, and we have no choice but to go after them. And it's their fault. It's their responsibility that all these civilians are dying. Now, it is true that Hamas is using the population as human shields. It's also a bit difficult not to use them as human shields, because where can Hamas operate? I mean, the whole area is so congested. It has to operate from someplace. But they are using civilians as human shields. But that does not mean that you can act in the way that the IDF is acting. It can be something that you say to the Israeli public to make them feel okay about it. But in terms of international law, that's not the case, because in terms of international law, when an army moves into occupies an area or is fighting in an area, that army is responsible for the civilians under its control. And if it harms those civilians, and that's what you are saying from the Geneva Convention and the various other protocols, then if it is not taking care of that population, or if it's harming it, or if it's killing it, or if it's producing conditions that would bring about its death, then that army may well be carrying out war crimes. Now, as for, is it worth anything, all of that? What do we need all this? All these international agreements if nobody is ever brought to account? Look, I mean, this argument has been made many times. We obviously would like to have much greater enforcement of international law, but international law is international. That is, it's a law between nations. And so in order to enforce it, you need the international community, which is made up of states, to enforce it. And as long as they don't enforce it, things can go on. Is it because of that worthless? I don't think so. Because first of all, you have standards. You can say what you were just saying now. You can say there is a law agreed by multiple nations, including the State of Israel, who is a signatory to the Geneva Conventions, not to all the protocols, but to the Geneva Convention itself. And you can point to that and say, these are crimes. Now, they may never be brought to justice, but we can say, by our judgment, and this appears to be crimes. And secondly, in the long run, I think people do worry about it. One interesting thing is that the Israeli military, now for quite a while, not when I served in the army, but in more recent years, is accompanied by large cohorts of lawyers who are actually there to make sure that one can sell whatever the Israeli military is doing as acceptable according to international law. Much of this has been waived quite openly by the Israeli military and by Israeli politicians since October 7th. That is, they are not following the rules that they set to themselves before October 7th. They are behaving in ways that they themselves would have found unacceptable before October 7th. But all of this is being observed, and I think that to say that it's useless would be a mistake, because international law, much despite all its faults and all its problems, is better than not having it. If you can find a leader of a state, as say happened with Putin, if a leader of a state is found guilty or is indicted for breaches of international law, that has an effect. That has an effect on that leader's ability to move around, on that leader's legitimacy, if not in the eyes of his own people, then in the rest of the world. It has an effect. It's not as effective as one would like. And the ICC, as you know, the United States is not a signatory to the ICC. International Criminal Court, and the United States is in many ways the policeman of the world. So if it's not a signatory, then it makes enforcement even more difficult. But it is still better to have it than not to have it. That's the way I see it.
Because you mentioned Putin, yeah? I think one challenge that Israel has at the moment is the double standard that became apparent after we just went through this whole proxy war between the US and Russia, right? Where von der Leyen said, it's a war crime to bomb hospitals when Russia does it, but when Israel does it, it's not a war crime. So this blatant double standard, which is now open for everyone to see, will be difficult for Israel to counterbalance.
Yes, I mean, I think, look, what Israel is carrying out now, completely independently of what Russia is doing in Ukraine, stands on its own. So we don't need to compare it to what Russia is doing to say this is completely unacceptable. It's the argument that the Israelis have been trying to make, not that successfully, is that under these hospitals, there were Hamas headquarters, they found tunnels there. The evidence is at best ambivalent or ambiguous. It's not, they've not been able to really make a clear case for it, which is not to say that Hamas was not building tunnels near hospitals, but whether these piers were actually leading to the hospitals or not, and then they blew up the whole thing. So we'll never know. We also know that some of those underground structures under the Shifa hospital were actually built by the Israelis at the time. So they both knew where they were, and they built them for other purposes. So the evidence, as I say, is such that we don't need to talk about Russia for that. There is an interesting aspect to this. I found that kind of ironic that President Biden was arguing that one had to defend both Israel and Ukraine because these were two democracies that needed to be defended. But in fact, of course, the case of Israel and Ukraine are exactly the opposite. In the case of Ukraine, Ukraine was a democracy, a sovereign state with internationally recognized borders that was invaded by another country, which happens to be an autocracy and a country with an imperial history that wanted to extend its empire back into Ukraine, where it had once been. In the case of Israel, Israel was in fact involved in curbing and uprising within areas that it occupies. Israel was the occupier. And Gaza was in fact occupied by Israel, at least by its external borders. And so this was not a democracy defending itself, it was a democracy involved in aggressive action against people and territories that it had occupied. As for its status as a democracy, Israel controls an area from the Jordan to the sea, from the Galilee or from the Lebanese border to the Sinai Peninsula, in which there are 7 million Palestinians and 7 million Jews. And only the 7 million Jews have full democracy, which itself was being challenged by their own government just in the months leading to October 7th. The 2 million Palestinians who are Israeli citizens actually are second-class citizens. The 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank have no democracy, and the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are not only besieged by Israel, but were also living under Hamas rule, which definitely also was not democratic. And so to say that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East was a kind of, you had to see that through a very particular prism in order to accept that argument.
Because you just brought up apartheid, right? So apartheid, I think the UN General Assembly in 1966, I have it in front of me, labeled apartheid as a crime against humanity, right? And then they updated this in 1948. Yeah, the Security Council endorsed this determination, Resolution 556, right? So from the UN perspective, and we can argue on a semantic level, is it now apartheid or not? But the hallmarks are there, right? So that's yet another label that we can stick on this conflict.
Yeah, I mean, in the August 4th Elephant in the Room statement that we issued, we spoke about apartheid and in the West Bank. And interestingly, many of the people who signed that statement, who were rather mainstream scholars, people writing on genocide, on the Holocaust, on Jewish history, quite a number of Israeli scholars as well. These are people who a year earlier would not have signed a petition that had the word apartheid in it. And this time they did. This is 2 months before the attack by Hamas. And the reason I think people did it is that they understood finally what this government was about and what it was trying to do, quite apart from the more specific or the more general context of Israeli rule in the West Bank. We believed, and I certainly believe, that Israel had installed an apartheid regime in the West Bank. And the simple reason for this is that there are two populations there. One, they live under two totally different systems of law. There are between 500,000 and 750,000 settlers, depending on how you count them, and they live under Israeli law. They are extraterritorial Israeli citizens. They live in an occupied territory that is not recognized by the international community as part of the state of Israel. They vote to the Israeli Knesset, and they are subjected to Israeli laws. The 3 million Palestinians who live there live under military law. They are tried by military courts. The judges in these courts are lawyers in reserve service. And these are draconian laws, and they have no rights. They can be put in detention for as long as administrative arrest for years. There's no limitation on that. They can be tried for crimes, for alleged crimes, for which they or their lawyers cannot see the evidence because the evidence is considered to be military secret. And so they can be put in jail, found guilty, without anyone actually saying what they're guilty of. It's a completely Kafkaesque situation. Quite apart from the fact that they also don't any longer have freedom of movement. They certainly don't have freedom of expression. They are not safe from arbitrary arrest. So everything that we see that we take for granted in a democratic society, they lack. And their neighbors right next to them live under a system of law where they are assured of all these rights. So according to the UN resolution on genocide, this is on apartheid. This is clearly an apartheid regime. There are, I think, 7 categories there, and all these categories conform to the kind of system that Israel has put into place in the West Bank.
Amnesty International came out with a report this year called Automated Apartheid, right? It goes even a step further because it's high-resolution facial recognition systems together with artificial intelligence algorithms called the Wolfpack, and then fed into autonomous shooting systems. Means fully automated executions, right?
Yes, only yes, you're right. They're using all of these techniques as far as I know. Of course, all police forces in the world now use it. Britain is totally, there's security cameras in every street corner. So part of that is, in some ways, a larger issue. But I was chuckling also because Israel, or the Israeli military, came to believe so much in these automated systems that these kind of automated systems, including these electric machine guns, were one reason why Hamas so easily got over the fence and went on the attack. These things work only if you are prepared for all kinds of scenarios that clearly the IDF was not prepared for. And one tragedy was that there were, just to go back to that there were numerous military observers who were young women soldiers who were charged with observing from these observation posts that also had all these electric machine guns and all kinds of other observation electronics. They were warning about the imminent Hamas attack because they could see them training. And they were telling their commanders, look, something is going to happen. They were even telling their parents. Most of these young women were killed on October 7th. And nobody took responsibility for that. And they were killed because, sure, they were killed by Hamas, of course. But the reason that nobody paid attention to them was this kind of arrogance, which was both macho and generally the arrogance of the Israeli military, that yes, they may be training these Hamas people, but they're incapable of doing anything against our sophisticated electronic system. So you can use it, as Israel has done, for policing actions. And that's what has happened on the West Bank. The West Bank is policed by the military. The military have turned into police forces, not into combat troops, but policemen. But if you try to use it against a well-organized group like Hamas, or even, God forbid, if the war expands in the north against Hezbollah, it's not enough. You actually need trained soldiers and not just electric machine guns.
Because you said the war might expand into the north, maybe into Lebanon too, right? with the Israeli force, which has, to my knowledge, also the current Israeli force has no combat experience, right?
Well, they're gaining it now, of course,
Yeah, in Gaza. Yeah,
Gaza. Yes,
yeah.
so they, unfortunately, um, yes, it may. I mean, it's a very scary scenario. What we are watching right now uh, is a scenario where what is happening in Gaza may be just the beginning of a much wider conflict. Hezbollah in the north has an estimated 150,000 rockets. It has tens of thousands of well-trained guerrilla fighters, well-equipped, who gained a lot of experience fighting in Syria. You have militias, Iranian militias in Syria. You have the Houthis now who are involved in the fighting. You now have militias operating from Iraq. So Israel seems to be dragging the entire region into a conflict that can be avoided. And there's almost it's hard to understand the logic of it by now, because if Israel goes into Lebanon now, it will be extending the war and putting so much pressure on its own military, on its own economy, on the international community, that what we are going to see, I suspect, is that the Israeli army will get bogged down in Lebanon as it is right now in Gaza. And I must say, the Israeli operation in Gaza has already failed. This is a failed operation. This is the second debacle. The first debacle was October 7th. This is the second debacle. The Israeli military recruited 350,000 reservists. It has a top-of-the-line aircraft. It has modern tanks and artillery. And it is fighting against, let's say, about 40,000 lightly armed guerrillas. It's been fighting for 8 weeks, and it hasn't accomplished its two goals. One was to release the hostages. Those who were released during a ceasefire, not because of Israeli operations, but the other 129 are still there. And it has not destroyed Hamas, neither its political leadership nor its military abilities. And that's after 8 weeks of fighting. And I don't think it will be able to accomplish it. What it can accomplish is to destroy Gaza. But it has not accomplished its military goals. If it now goes to Lebanon, then it's going to be bogged down into fighting for years and years without any way out, apart from, again, as I say, deciding that it's time to reach a political resolution and not try to resolve things only by force.
Because you said logic. Noam Chomsky told me, Ben Gvir and Smotrich, they don't care if they blow up the whole world. God is on their side. That's what he literally said.
Yes, I mean they do believe that God is on their side, but I think, I mean, apart from being messianic and believing that they see, they can chart the course of history, and I think they are also nihilists. So it isn't that they think that God is on their side to achieve some kind of goal, some positive goal, that they are leading us all to paradise. No, what they want to do is, unfortunately, rather similar to the kind of goal that Hamas has. If you read what they say, and if you read the Hamas charter, you will find that they basically have the same idea. They want to create a religious state in which only their people live. Hamas wants to create an Islamic Palestinian state with as few Jews, if any, living there. And Smotrich and Ben Gvir want to create a halachic state, a Jewish state, where Jews will live under Jewish law and where Palestinians will not be able to live or live as helots. That's so it isn't simply that they believe in God. They believe that anything is worth reaching this goal, however much destruction. And Smotrich has been quoted as saying, I mean, we don't need to care about the hostages. The main thing is just to destroy Gaza. And if the hostages die, then so be it. These are statements that Israeli politicians in the past have never made. Even if they acted ultimately in this manner, they've never made these kind of statements. So these are fanatics on both sides. And God, yeah, God is obviously on their side, but what to me is much more important is that the fanatics, the zealots, they are the main danger in this region. And there's more and more of those, of course, popping up in this region, as well as in some other countries in the world now.
Yeah. I heard you say that ethnic cleansing can become genocide. Yeah. So if we have those four categories, we have war crimes, genocide, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. So where are we in this let's say scale?
Right, and we should say that ethnic cleansing is not defined under international law. It appears as population displacement or removal, but we know what we are talking about. So uh, basically, ethnic cleansing is the attempt to remove a population from a particular territory, usually an ethnic group, so as to leave it for your people, for your group. And if they go, then you don't care where they go. And the genocide is the attempt to destroy that group as such, in whole or in part. I think that the way I've been thinking about it just in the last week or so, as more and more information is coming in, the things depend greatly on what will happen in the next few weeks. I think the to give it the most generous description, the Israeli military claims to have moved people out of these areas so as a humanitarian action, so as to protect them from military operations. Then they destroy those areas. And they haven't made any commitment to let people back into those areas, right? If people are not let back in, or if people are pushed further out into Sinai or wherever, this would look like ethnic cleansing. And all the arguments that they were moved just to protect them will be shown to have been just propaganda, right? Now, maybe they will be allowed back. We can't tell for sure. But the trajectory appears to be not to let them back. That is, that they will have been ethnically cleansed. That's number one. Number two, when you talk about ethnic cleansing and it's linked to genocide, historically, genocide often begins as ethnic cleansing. And that happened in the German genocide of the Herero in 1904. It happened in the Armenian genocide. Arguably, that's what happened also in the Holocaust. The idea was to kick the Jews out. But eventually, there was no place for them to go. So the most humane thing to do with them was to kill them. This was Nazi speak. Now, what do you do with a population in Gaza where you have 2.2 million people congested someplace and they're not going anywhere? They're not leaving. They're not getting enough water. They're not getting enough food. They are dying, not just from military actions, but from epidemics, from famine. You may be tempted to start killing them so as to make them run. And that can become genocide. So that you are targeting them specifically as an ethnic group to remove them from the territory, and you're doing that by trying to destroy that group. So I think that we are somewhere there. I think it can be reversed, but it has to happen now. It can be reversed if the Israeli government, under duress, declares that, okay, It's stopping the military operations, and it will be prepared to think about a political resolution first on the ground in Gaza, and then a larger political resolution of the conflict with the Palestinians. That there would be some mechanism to remove Hamas or Hamas leadership from Gaza, that they would go into some kind of exile, that there would be an interim leadership there, that there would be gradual return of populations and rebuilding of the infrastructure. That can be done, but right now, the opposite is happening. And if that continues, then yes, I'm afraid that we are looking at ethnic cleansing and genocide.
The language that politicians, I mean, common people too, but politicians are more impacting both in Israel and outside, especially in the US. So really genocidal language is quite, how shall I say this best, staggering, right? So the Minister of Intelligence, I have a couple of those statements here. Yeah? So the Minister of Intelligence, yeah, all Palestinians from Gaza should go to the Sinai Peninsula. By the way, I'm just back from Amman. I know that Amman and Egypt, they're moving tanks to the borders to avoid Israel pushing Palestinians into their territories, right? Then we have Isaac, also the Israeli president, yeah? There are no innocent civilians in Gaza, yeah? Netanyahu with his amazing statement about Amalek. Maybe you as a historian, maybe in a nutshell, can you elaborate on his statement of Amalek?
Yeah, this was a few weeks ago when Netanyahu said, you should remember what Amalek did to you. Now, when you say that to an Israeli public, most people know what it means. So Amalek was, some people that attacked the Israelites when they were crossing the desert from Egypt to Palestine, to the Holy Land, to Eretz Israel. And the orders given to the Israelites by God himself were, and it appears in various places in the Bible, were that you should kill Amalek, all of Amalek, the men, the women, the children, the babies, they should all be slaughtered, their cattle, their sheep, and so forth. So it's a kind of genocidal statement by God himself to the Israelites. So when you say you should remember Amalek, this is what you're alluding to. And Netanyahu, is smart enough not to say exactly what it is, but he knows that people understand what he's implying. Herzog is less smart and less savvy. And so Herzog, who is the president of the state and who was once the leader of the Labour Party, who is much more moderate, or supposedly much more moderate than Netanyahu. He was in an election campaign against Netanyahu some years ago. And he said, in Gaza, there is no difference. They're all guilty. When you make such statements, the first effect of these statements is incitement. They're inciting troops. So we talked before about this sort of IDF tactics. But beyond tactics, these are soldiers, and many of them are reservists. Many of them have voted for Netanyahu, right? I mean, the right in Israel is much stronger than the left. That's reflected also in the population of the IDF, certainly in the reserve forces. And they hear these statements. What do you think? How do you think they will respond to it? They will act whether they have orders or not. And if their commanders see them acting in ways that are not exactly according to the military rules, the commanders also are listening to these statements by their generals and by their commanders. So it's incitement. It creates more and more unlawful conduct by the military. But of course, more generally, when political leaders and top army commanders use this kind of language, and also dehumanizing language, they speak of Hamas as human animals, but sometimes they don't say Hamas. They just say these people are human animals. Who are these people? It's Gaza. They're all human animals. Nowadays, they use the word Nazi a great deal. You turn on the TV and they're speaking about Hamas Nazis. Now, when you say Hamas Nazis in Israel, it immediately brings up the Holocaust. People immediately have this response, oh, so we're fighting Nazis. What do you do with Nazis? You kill them. I mean, you can't talk, you can't negotiate with Nazis. You have to kill them all. They tried to kill us. So you're already making all these connections, not only in a sort of general statement about, you know, remember what Amalek did or the human animals. No, they're Nazis. That is the way they killed our ancestors in Europe. Now they're trying to kill us here, and we will not go like sheep to the slaughter. We will go and kill them. That's the kind of triggers that are operating now in Israeli society. And yes, it is extremely concerning. There is no, in a sense, there is no responsible person in Israel who will stop that. It has to be stopped from elsewhere. There has to be, and there can be, and it's easy to put pressure on Israel, but it's not being done.
No, because in America, so next year is an election year, so it's very double for Biden. Yeah, on one side he needs the support of the Jewish/Israeli lobby. Yeah, on the other side there are I think Gallup polls now that show the younger the population, the less they support Israel and the more they support Palestine. So it's a double-sided sword for Biden. And I have spoken 2 days ago with the former Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, Charles Freeman. And he said to me that he expects, or he would not be surprised if Trump will win. So if Trump wins, this will, I don't know where this is going to. You then have a civil war in the US, and you might even have a civil war in Israel.
Well, Netanyahu is certainly hoping that this will happen, and he's biding his time. And as long as Netanyahu is in power, the war will not end. Netanyahu has no interest in this war ending, because if it ends, he may actually go to jail. And so he will try to find some way to keep the war going, and hoping that Biden will lose the election. Biden has a good chance of losing the election. I mean, no one knows who is going to win, but clearly, what has happened in Israel and Gaza is putting him, as you said, in a bind, because the younger voters, including many young Jewish voters, are turning against him. If you sort of walk around American universities, which I know quite well from my experience here, he is extremely unpopular. Now, these are not people who will vote for Trump, but they will either vote for a third candidate or they won't vote at all, which means that Trump would win. And of course, Biden is afraid of being more directly assertive with Israel because he's afraid of losing the more traditional liberal vote, which is very pro-Israel. I think it's a mistake. I think Biden could, in fact, craft a policy and explain that policy to the American public, which is not done yet, and say why it is crucial for the good, both for the national interests of the United States, but also for the good of Israel, to put an end to this war, and that the United States is doing what it can to do that. And what it can do, first and foremost, is stop sending so many tank shells and artillery shells to Israel, which Israel needs desperately right now. It's running out of them. And in fact, there's some information in Israel that supplies from the US have slowed down.
Because America is also running out. Yeah.
So either because America is running out, or because the US is behind closed doors, they're saying it's bureaucratic reasons. Behind closed doors is saying, look, I mean, you have to slow down, otherwise we're going to slow down with the supplies. It's possible. I have no inside information on this, but it's possible. But I think that's insufficient. I think it has to be public policy. I think the US has to say that it is time now for Israel to begin negotiating politics. The only way to stop this, for the good of Israel itself, not only because of the tens of thousands of Palestinians who have died by now, but also for the good of the Jewish state to move to the political phase. Right now, this is a war that is being fought without a political goal. Wars that are fought without political goals become wars of destruction. You never know when to end them. You never know when you win. You just keep fighting. There has to be a political goal, and the only political goal there can be is negotiations over Palestinian state. There can be no other. And Biden's actually said it, but he has not enforced it. And he's not crafted a fully fledged policy around it. That's what he must do. If I were advising the White House, which I'm certainly not, he should get a working group together of experts from Israel and the Middle East who would craft that policy, do it in the most expedited manner possible, and bring that to Israel as a take or leave option. You leave it, you're on your own. And they won't leave it. They will take it. Because in Israel, any move by the US government, despite all the bravado, immediately causes an earthquake. Any sort of critical statement immediately causes everyone to be, and the Israeli public by now itself is so full of fear, has such a deep sense of insecurity since the 7th of October, and because it knows that it has a completely incompetent government. The government is not even taking care of several hundreds of thousands of Israeli citizens who've been displaced from the south and from the north. It's not doing anything. So the public feels entirely vulnerable. And if the US government were to say, look, we will support you, but we will support you in a political move, no longer in a military one, that maybe it would bring down the downfall of Netanyahu, which is necessary. I suspect it will, but that would be only a good thing to finally have a rational government in Israel. It would not be a left-wing government. It would not be a liberal government, but it would be a rational government that would realize that it must reach or begin the process of politics and put an end to the military side.
I hope, or we all hope, on negotiations, I think. Yeah. Now, Professor, I have one last topic, if I may. And what I said at the beginning, it's in regards to first-person history. Now, the context is I returned just from Amman, where I interviewed myself, the second survivor of the Tantura massacre from 1948, right? I dove into this. There's a whole backstory. I will not bore you with the details here, but these kind of interviews are quite impacting and moving. Yeah. In the case of Amman, it was a 90-year-old lady. Her family was in Iraq when it was her family was in Kuwait when it was invaded, so they had to flee a second time. Yeah, so two of those kind of major events in one life. Yeah, and I read in one book, and you will understand in a moment why I'm interested in this. Yeah, so in your book Genocide, the Holocaust, and Israel-Palestine, I believe on page 20, and I have it in front of me. You wrote, precisely because genocide is about the destruction of groups as such, it is the duty of the historian to rescue these groups from oblivion, even if only in history and memory. One way to oppose the will of the genocide... I had to look this word up, yeah? One way to oppose the will of the genocidaires, yeah? Genocidaire, yeah? To obliterate both the existence and the memory of the victims is to let the victims speak and to listen to their voices. That's exactly what I did. But I found a documentary about Tantura where a professor emeritus of history, Yoav Gelber from the University of Haifa, he said, I don't believe in witnesses. Oral evidence is good for folklore, but not for history. Yeah. So I was stunned how easy a renowned as a professor emeritus of history wipes away witness testimony that's clearly not fitting his paradigm.
Yes, and when I started writing on this and thinking about first-person history and using in several books large amounts of testimonies, it was about the Holocaust. It wasn't about Israel-Palestine. And many historians, including Jewish historians, and certainly many German historians, were totally dismissive of first-person history. They said, no, people remember things, but they get the names wrong, the dates wrong, they are influenced by what happened afterwards. You can't trust it. You need to use documents. Go to the archive, use documents. Now, when you do that, in the case of genocide or in the case of any extreme event, what you get is the point of view of those who wrote the documents. Now, who writes documents in genocide? Not those people that you're killing. It's the people doing the killing. So the history you write, even if you, of course, don't support the genocide. I mean, who supports the Nazi genocide of the Jews? But as a German historian, you're using the documents written in German by German bureaucrats, and by force, you are already seeing the event through their eyes because it's they who are describing it. It's they who explain it. And what you don't see is what they don't see. What they don't see is the victims. They don't care about the victims. The victims are just the byproduct, right? They don't know them. They don't care about them. They don't interact with them. And in their own collective memory, they don't exist. They exist as numbers, not as people. And so when I started dealing with this and when I wrote that line, I was thinking, first of all, what happens if you write a history of a genocide, including the voices of the people who were subjected to it? Obviously, in most cases, those who survived it, because those who died, you will never hear their voices. That's what Primo Levi wrote in a famous essay on precisely this question. I mean, who can tell what happened? Now, that does not mean that you don't use other documents. Of course you do. You can use the documents of the killers, you can use the documents of the bystanders, but you also have to listen to the people who were there. So that's as a sort of general take, and things have changed in the historiography of the Holocaust. Now, if you look at it from the point of view of Israel-Palestine, which is not a finished event, the Holocaust is over, right? German historians writing about the extermination of the Jews are writing about the past, right? Maybe their parents or grandparents or uncles were involved in it, but they are of a different generation, and none of this is happening now. But when you look at it from the point of view, say, of Tantura, of what happened in Tantura, it's not only what happened then, it's what happened subsequently. If you talk with Palestinians, which obviously you have, they will tell you the Nakba, the expulsion of the Palestinians in 1948, didn't end. It's still going on. They're still refugees. They're still being persecuted. You see what is happening in the West Bank now. You see what is happening in Gaza now. It's not a finished thing. It's also not finished for the Jewish Israelis because they're still involved in this, right? They're still hiding that history. They're still fighting as Palestinians. They still say, we have a right and they don't. It's an ongoing thing. And so that, first of all, makes that history into not only history, but also very present. And then if you start talking about who then has the right to speak. So the most important book that was written on the expulsion of 48, on the Nakba, or on the creation of the Palestinian question, was written by Benny Morris.
Yeah, I interviewed him.
Right. And Benny Morris, who now has taken a slightly different take, but at the time, and including when he came to talk at Brown once, and we talked exactly on this issue, said, look, I mean, I don't believe, like Gelber, he said the same thing. I don't believe in all these, some old people remember things, you can't trust them, who knows, you need documents. And he used documents. In that book, he used documents, Israeli army and political documents. And through these documents, he documented the expulsion of the Palestinians. And that was the power of the book, that it was using Israeli documents to show that it happened. And after he published that book, no one could deny anymore that it happened. Whereas had you interviewed some elderly Palestinians, and they said, I remember that. People say, yeah, sure, he remembers, but that's not what happened. When you use the documents, that's the power of that. But what it does, it also means that many cases that happened are not documented. So, first of all, there are many cases that disappear because the army didn't document them, or the bureaucracy didn't document them, or the documents were destroyed. And secondly, you don't see the whole thing through the eyes of those who were subjected to it. You only see it through the eyes of those who are carrying it out, who invariably provide themselves with a whole series of rationales as to why they were doing it. They were shooting at us. They were part of the enemy. There were spies there. So the story that you tell comes in with all the kind of built-in justifications. If you include the voices of the people who were there, those who were being expelled, those who are being humiliated, then you start understanding it through their eyes. And what it does is not only help you reconstruct the story, it creates an empathy between you and those people. You start thinking of them as yourself. You start thinking, Golda Meir in 1948 came to visit Haifa right after it was captured by the Haganah, by the pre-state Jewish
Precursor of the
military
Israeli
organization.
army.
Yes. So she came there and she saw homes that had just been vacated by the Palestinian inhabitants. And there was still food on the table. And she said at the time, it reminded her, she came from Ukraine via the US, but she was a child in the Ukraine. In Ukraine, and she said this reminded her of what happened to the Jews. Right? It created, for a moment, it created an empathy. Now, it didn't have any political conclusions because shortly thereafter she opposed allowing the refugees to come back. But there was a moment of empathy. And that empathy, that sense that you can get only when you see things through the eyes of those people who had been the objects of this violence, that is part of what we should do as historians. I was, for years, I thought the kind of histories written of the Holocaust, which are all about how the decision was crafted, how important was Wannsee, all those things. And they never told you what the thing itself was. It was all about killing people, killing children, about brutality, and it never came up. And historians had this safe distance from it, right? And that is something that one has to bring also to the story of what happened in Palestine. That's not to say that the Nakba was like the Holocaust. It was not like the Holocaust. It's two different things. But in writing about it, if you don't bring in the voices of the people who were subjected to that, the voices of the people who lost their homes, who lost their families, who lost their lands, and who have carried that memory from one generation to the other, you will never understand how this entire people works. You'll never understand its sort of collective memory, its collective identity. And I did that just now, just before everything happened. Between October and January 2022, I interviewed scores of people in Israel, Jews and Palestinians, people of my generation, that is, people who were born in the 1950s, more or less, right after the state was established. And we talked a great deal about the homes that they grew up in. And these were all deeply traumatized homes, whether traumatized because these were families that came from Europe after the Holocaust or lost families in the Holocaust, or traumatized because these were people who lost their homes in 1948, who, even though they stayed in what became the State of Israel, they lost their homes. They were internally displaced and have remained so to this day. And that creates a sense of empathy, of closeness, that you suddenly see these populations that live side by side and often see themselves as diametrically opposed are actually carrying with them memories that have a great deal in common. And if you are capable of understanding that, then maybe you are also bringing yourself closer to the conclusion that these people can share the place, that they can live together, rather than be involved either in killing each other or in having these oppositional narratives. They were our enemy, they did this to us. And think of themselves as sharing a traumatic, a painful past, but one that can actually bring them together rather than tear them apart.
So talking to survivors definitely creates empathy, right? And empathy is the antidote to dehumanization, right? The solution could be right there. Talk to each other, right?
It can, as long as you're willing to, because it can create denial. And that's when you are talking about people like Gerber or Maurice, who now is actually using first-person history. God bless him. Um, that to get over the denial, to listen to people rather than to correct them. Part of the conversations that I'm very familiar with in Israel is that people say something and the other person says, no, 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 it didn't happen then, it happened there. No, that's not why it happened. No, to listen to people, not to deny what they're saying, to listen to them tell you what's in their heart, what's in their memory, what has moved them. That, if you open up to that, then yes, then that's the first step to some kind of resolution, or at least of understanding.
You're absolutely right. You have to bypass or overcome our built-in confirmation bias, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, this is not going to work. Professor Omer, you were incredibly generous with your time. I see I have overstayed my welcome massively. I deeply apologize, but I could not bring myself to interrupt you. Yeah, it was a fascinating conversation. I can only thank you again, yeah, for your time. What would be your last concluding words?
Look, I mean, we are just in a very sad moment in the Middle East. I was born and grew up in Israel, and I'm very saddened by what I see, and very troubled and very worried about what's going to happen also to the society that I know, the society of Jews in Israel, and where it's heading. And of course, the horrible killing of Palestinians in Gaza. So what are my concluding words? My concluding words would be that every uh, citizen of the world, wherever they are, and whatever they think, should use their own power as citizens and impress on their representatives, on their governments, on the media, wherever they can, to bring this killing to a stop, and not to stop there, not to just demand a ceasefire, which will be good but won't end anything, but to demand that this horrible conflict that has gone on for way too long is finally brought to an end, and that the zealots and extremists on both sides are removed from there, and that the people, both Palestinians and Jews, most of whom I'm certain just want to live a life, just want to have a future for their children, are given the kind of leadership that they deserve, and some peace in the future.
On that note, Professor Omer, thank you again. It was my pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much.